Walk into any modern pharmacy in any city in the world, from New York to Buenos Aires, and you'll find yourself surrounded by a feeling of sterile safety. White light, organized shelves, air conditioning. It's a temple of health. And at the center of that temple, you will almost always see a logo you've known since you were a child. A simple circle. A cross formed by 5 letters repeated horizontally and vertically. B-A-Y-E-R. For most of us, that logo is synonymous with relief. It's the aspirin you took when you had a fever. It's the syrup your mother gave you. It's German science, precise, reliable, dedicated, as their famous slogan goes, to a better life. We have been taught to trust that green or blue cross. We have been conditioned to believe that what's inside those boxes was designed exclusively for our well-being. But that trust is an illusion, a marketing facade carefully constructed over 160 years to hide a much darker reality. Because if you could scrape the white paint off that logo, if you could look through the microscope of history, you would not see molecules of healing. You would see blood. You would see the mass addiction of millions of children. You would see experiments on human beings, and you would see the birth of the most destructive substance ever to ravage humanity. This is not the story of a benevolent company that made a few mistakes in the past. This is the chronicle of an entity that discovered very early in its history that death is a far more profitable business than life. It is the story of how a small dye workshop in the Whooper River Valley transformed itself into the greatest legal drug dealer in history, selling pure heroin as a remedy for children's cough. Forget everything you think you know about medical ethics. We are about to enter a world where patients are not people, but customers, where side effects don't matter, as long as the profits keep flowing. Welcome to the true history of Bayer. Welcome to the pharmacy of the devil. To understand the origin of this monster, we must travel back in time. We must leave behind the sterile cleanliness of modern laboratories and descend into the dirty, deafening chaos of the Industrial Revolution. Germany, 1863. The country is changing at a dizzying speed. The old medieval cities are being devoured by red brick factories, spewing black smoke into the sky 24 hours a day. The air smells of sulfur and coal. The Rhine River, once a source of romantic poetry, is now an industrial artery poisoned by the chemical waste of a new era. In the small city of Barmen, today part of Wuppertal, 2 men form an unlikely partnership. Friedrich Bayer is a salesman, a man with a commercial instinct sharp as a razor blade. Johann Friedrich Westcott is a master dyer, a modern-era alchemist who knows how to manipulate chemicals to create colors. Originally, they had no desire to cure anyone. They wanted to dye fabric. In those days, synthetic chemistry was in its infancy, and the big business was creating artificial dyes for the textile industry. The world wanted bright colors, fuchsine, aniline, and Bayer and Westcott were ready to give it to them. Their first factory was not a medical research center. It was a poison kitchen. Workers handled arsenic and heavy metals with their bare hands. Waste was dumped directly into the river. The life expectancy of an employee was short, but the profits were enormous. However, toward the end of the 19th century, science took an unexpected turn. Chemists discovered that the same coal tar byproducts used to make blue and red dyes also had strange effects on the human body. Some lowered fever, others killed pain. Bayer, always with his nose pointed at money, smelled an opportunity. The drug market was completely unregulated. There was no FDA, no mandatory clinical trials, no consumer protection laws. If you could bottle a liquid and convince people it cured something, you could get rich. The company decided to transform itself. They built a massive new complex in Elberfeld. They hired an army of young, ambitious chemists and gave them a single order: Invent things we can patent. They were not looking for scientific truth. They were looking for intellectual property. They wanted molecules that belonged exclusively to them. In this atmosphere of chemical gold, fever enters the scene our tragic protagonist, a man whose name should be as famous as Louis Pasteur or Alexander Fleming, but whom history has relegated to an ambiguous footnote. His name was Felix Hoffmann. Felix Hoffmann did not look like a villain. He was a typical young German chemist of his era, meticulous, serious, with round glasses and a carefully groomed mustache. He worked in the pharmaceutical department of Bayer under the supervision of Heinrich Drieser, a man whose ambition and lack of scruples would play a central role in this tragedy. Hoffmann had a personal motivation for his work. His father, a retired industrialist, suffered from paralyzing rheumatism. His joints were inflamed and every movement was torture. In those days, the only common remedy for rheumatism was salicylic acid, a substance derived from willow bark. But salicylic acid had a terrible problem. It was corrosive. It burned the stomachs of patients, causing ulcers and bloody vomiting. Hoffmann's father faced an impossible choice: live with unbearable pain in his knees or live with unbearable pain in his stomach. Felix became obsessed with finding a solution. He spent his nights in the laboratory mixing flasks, searching for a way to modify the chemical structure of the acid to make it tolerable. And on August 10, 1897, he succeeded. Through a process called acetylation, Hoffmann managed to synthesize a pure and stable form of acetyl salicylic acid. He tested it first on himself, then on his father. The result was miraculous. The pain disappeared. The stomach held firm. He had created the perfect painkiller. Bayer named it Aspirin, A for acetyl, and spire from the plant Spirea ulmaria, the source of the acid. If the story had ended there, Felix Hoffmann would be remembered today as a secular saint, the man who took away the world's pain. Aspirin became the best-selling medicine of all time. A magic pill that not only relieved pain, but, as we would discover decades later, prevented heart attacks. It was the white angel of pharmacology. But fate has a macabre sense of humor, because in that same laboratory, at that same workbench, just 11 days after discovering aspirin, Felix Hoffmann committed the error that would condemn millions. On August 21, 1897, Hoffmann was still experimenting with acetylation. This time, he did not use salicylic acid. He used morphine. Morphine, derived from the opium poppy, was the most potent known painkiller, but it was highly addictive. The hospitals of Europe were full of soldiers and patients turned into morphine addicts. The medical community was desperately searching for a substitute, something that could soothe coughs. Tuberculosis was the #1 cause of death, and kill pain, but without hooking the patient. Hoffmann mixed morphine with acetic acid and heated it for hours. The result was a white, crystalline, odorless substance with a bitter taste. Chemically, it was called diacetylmorphine. Hoffmann didn't know what he had just created. He thought he had done to morphine what he had done to aspirin, create a safer, more tolerable version. He could not have been more wrong. By acetylating the morphine, he had made it far more soluble in fats. This meant that when it entered the body, the substance could cross the blood-brain barrier, the brain's defense, far faster than the original morphine. It was a concentrated bomb of potency. As was customary at Bayer, the first test subjects were the factory workers and chemists themselves. They were given the substance in small doses. Their reactions were immediate and ecstatic. The employees reported that their coughs disappeared instantly. But more importantly, they reported a strange and powerful sensation. They said they felt euphoric, invincible, capable of anything. Fear left them, fatigue left them, sadness left them. In German, they described the feeling as heroisch, heroic. Heinrich Draeser, Hoffman's supervisor, who would receive royalties for every gram of heroin sold, published scientific articles categorically claiming that heroin was non-addictive. More than that, Bayer had the audacity to market heroin as the cure for morphine addiction. The logic was perverse. If you have a patient addicted to morphine, give them heroin. It's more potent, so they need less. And since it's not addictive, you can cure them. It was like trying to put out a fire by pouring gasoline on it. Thousands of morphine addicts switched to heroin, discovering with horror that the new drug was infinitely harder to quit. Bayer's remedy turned a medical crisis into a social epidemic. During the first decade of the 20th century, heroin production at the Bayer plant exploded. They produced tons every year. It was exported around the world. In the United States, you could buy Bayer heroin syrup by mail without a prescription. Mountain climbers took it for greater endurance at altitude. Opera singers used it to clear their throats before concerts. It was the drug of the moment, the Coca-Cola of painkillers. The heroin profits financed the massive expansion of Bayer. Those beautiful brick buildings in Leverkusen, the modern laboratories, the directors' villas, all built brick by brick with the money of addicts. From 1902 onward, letters began arriving at Bayer's offices. Letters from concerned doctors, letters from directors of psychiatric asylums. They reported strange cases, patients whose coughs had long since healed yet refused to stop taking the syrup. Mothers selling their jewelry to buy more medicine for their children. Respected men losing their jobs and ending up begging in the streets with gray skin and sunken eyes, pleading for one more dose of the heroic drug. A new medical term was coined, heroinism. In the hospitals of New York and Philadelphia, emergency rooms filled with a new class of walking dead. They were the world's first heroin addicts, and every single one of them had something in common. They had begun their addiction with a bottle bearing the Bayer cross on the label. The international medical community began sounding the alarm. By 1910, the reports on heroin's toxicity and addictive capacity were impossible to ignore. It was proven that the body metabolized heroin by converting it back into morphine, but at a speed and concentration the brain could not handle. And what did Bayer do in the face of this overwhelming evidence? Here we see the true face of the corporation. There was no voluntary recall, no public apology. There was an aggressive defense strategy. Karl Duisberg, Bayer's new strongman, ordered his representatives to silence the critics. They claimed doctors didn't know how to use the product properly, that addiction cases were anomalies, or the fault of the patient's moral weakness. Bayer continued producing and selling heroin until 1913, when the legal and public pressure became unbearable. But even then, they did not immediately halt global sales. They continued selling it in countries with laxer regulations for years. When production finally ceased officially, the damage was beyond calculation. Bayer had created a plague. They had released the genie from the bottle, and that genie had a needle in its hand. The legacy of Felix Hoffmann is a painful paradox. He died in 1946. Alone and forgotten in Switzerland. His obituary celebrated his invention of aspirin. No one mentioned the other child, but history does not forget. For the directors of Bayer, the heroin crisis was not a moral failure, it was simply a commercial setback. They had learned a valuable lesson. Chemistry has absolute power over human life, and that power is monetizable. While the world was preparing for the First World War, Bayer was no longer thinking about cough syrup. They were thinking about something bigger. If they could manipulate molecules to kill pain, couldn't they also manipulate them to kill enemies? The innocence of science had died in that heroin flask. Now a new era was opening, an era where chemists would not wear white lab coats, but military uniforms. an era where the objective would not be to heal individuals, but to exterminate entire armies. 1914. Europe is a powder keg on the verge of explosion, and Germany is the fuse. In Leverkusen, the city that Bayer had built practically from the ground up to house its empire, the smokestacks are no longer spewing only white steam. They have begun spewing something denser, darker. Felix Hoffmann was the naive scientist who created heroin by accident. The man now sitting on Bayer's throne is a very different creature. His name is Carl Duisberg. Duisberg is not a simple chemist. He is a titan, the Napoleon of the chemical industry, a man with an imperial mustache who lives in a palatial villa inside the factory grounds, surrounded by Japanese gardens and servants, while just a few yards from his window, thousands of workers breathe toxic vapors. Duisberg has a vision of the world terrifying in its simplicity. Chemistry is power, and the duty of industry is not to serve humanity, but to serve the German state and its shareholders. When the First World War broke out in August of 1914, most companies viewed the conflict with fear. Duisberg viewed it as the ultimate opportunity. The German army, the most feared war machine on the planet, had a critical problem. Germany was blockaded by the British Navy. They could not import Chilean saltpeter, the essential ingredient for manufacturing gunpowder and explosives. Without nitrates, the Kaiser's cannons would fall silent within 6 months. The High Command panicked. They summoned the industrialists. And here is where Carl Duisberg and his colleagues in the chemical industry made a Faustian pact that would change history. They promised the Kaiser that German science would solve what geography denied them. "Give us money," they said, "and we will pull explosives from thin air." They were referring to the nitrogen fixation process developed by another infamous name, Fritz Haber. Bayer, together with BASF and Hoechst, transformed their production lines overnight. The machines that pressed aspirin tablets were reconfigured. The tanks that mixed cough syrup were filled with nitric acid and toluene. The pharmacy of the devil stopped pretending it cared about health. It officially became the armory of the Reich. In Leverkusen, millions of tons of high explosives were manufactured. Every bullet that killed a French soldier on the Marne, every shell that tore open a trench on the Somme, carried the invisible stamp of the chemical industry that Duisberg directed. But explosives were only the beginning. Trench warfare had stalled. The generals needed something new, something that could flush the rats from their holes, something that killed not with brute force, but with scientific terror. And Carl Duisberg had the answer in his dye laboratories. April 22nd, 1915. Ypres, Belgium. It is a deceptively beautiful spring afternoon. In the Allied trenches, French and Algerian soldiers are resting. They have been fighting for months, but today the front is quiet. Too quiet. Suddenly, at 5 in the afternoon, the lookouts notice something strange along the German lines. It is not an infantry assault. It is not a bombardment. It is a cloud. A dense, dull, unnaturally yellow-green fog that creeps low along the ground, driven by a gentle north breeze toward the Allied trenches. The soldiers watch it with curiosity. Smoke to cover an advance? A strange weather phenomenon? Then the cloud reaches the front line, and hell is unleashed. The air fills with a sharp smell, a mixture of rotting pineapple and swimming pool chlorine concentrated 1,000 times. The men begin to cough, but it is not a normal cough. It is a violent convulsion. They bring their hands to their throats. Their eyes burn as if acid had been thrown in them. The chlorine gas, upon contact with the moisture in their lungs, converts to hydrochloric acid. The soldiers are literally dissolving from the inside. They are drowning in their own fluids on dry land. The panic is total. Thousands of men pour out of the trenches, running blind, spitting blood, collapsing to the ground with skin turned blue from lack of oxygen. The French line collapses within minutes. 6,000 men die that afternoon in a manner so horrible that even the most hardened veterans wept to witness it. That gas did not appear from nowhere. It was manufactured, bottled, and supplied by the major German chemical companies, with Bayer at the head. Karl Duisberg was not horrified. He was proud. He personally visited the front to see the results of his work. For him and for Fritz Haber, the gas was not a war crime. It was a humane way to shorten the conflict. Death by gas is sweeter than being torn apart by a grenade, they said in their private clubs while smoking cigars. Bayer threw itself completely into the production of chemical weapons. In its factories, a school of chemical warfare was established. Yes, a corporate school. There, German army officers did not learn to heal. They learned the best way to disperse poison according to wind direction. Bayer's scientists, the same ones who had searched for a cure for rheumatism, now calculated the density of phosgene needed to kill a battalion in 3 minutes. The escalation was rapid and brutal. Chlorine was easy to detect, so they invented something worse: phosgene, an invisible gas that smells like freshly cut hay and kills hours after it is breathed, when the lungs fill with fluid while the victim sleeps. And then came the king of horrors, mustard gas, also known as Yellow Cross. This gas, produced in massive quantities in Bayer's plants, did not need to be inhaled. It was a blister agent. If it touched your skin, it burned you. If it touched your clothing, it went straight through. Soldiers who survived mustard gas attacks were left blind, their bodies covered in enormous blisters filled with yellow pus, coughing up pieces of their own bronchial lining. It was a chemical torture designed to last weeks before death arrived. For 4 years, German science, financed by Bayer's money and its partners, turned the fields of Europe into an extermination laboratory. And while the soldiers died, the company's stock rose. War was, above all, excellent business. 1918. Germany loses the war. The Kaiser flees. The Treaty of Versailles attempts to bring the nation to its knees. The Allies confiscate Bayer's patents. In the United States, Bayer's subsidiary is auctioned off as enemy property. That is how Sterling Drug was born, which would sell Bayer aspirin in America for decades without any connection to Germany. It seemed like the end. Bayer had lost its markets, its international patents, and its reputation. But Karl Duisberg was not a man who accepted defeat. He surveyed the post-war landscape with its hyperinflation and political chaos, and arrived at a conclusion that would define the 20th century. "Competition is a luxury we cannot afford," he said. "We must become one body." Duisberg proposed something radical, not a simple alliance, but a total merger of the entire German chemical industry. Bayer, BASF, Höchst, Agfa, Griesheim Elektron, Weiler Ter Mir. All the giants that had manufactured gas and explosives were to unite under a single command. In 1925, Duisberg's dream became reality. IG Farben Industrie AG was born. The name was technical and dull, a community of interests in the dye industry. But the reality was that the most powerful corporation in Europe, and possibly the world, had just come into being. IG Farben was not a normal company. It was a supranational state. It had its own foreign policy, its own industrial espionage network. It owned coal mines, power plants, banks, and railroads. It controlled 100% of German dye production, 85% of explosives, and nearly all pharmaceutical output. If you were a German in 1925, IG Farben owned your life. The aspirin you took was theirs. The film in your camera was theirs. The fertilizer that grew your food was theirs, and although you didn't know it, the gas that would kill you in the future would be theirs as well. Carl Duisberg became the chairman of the supervisory board. He was the god of this new chemical Olympus. He built the largest office building in Europe in Frankfurt, the IG Farben building, a colossal structure of travertino marble that screamed power and domination. The elevators did not stop on all floors. The directors were physically above the employees. In these Frankfurt offices, the Council of Gods, as the directors called themselves, began planning the future. They did not care about the Weimar Republic. They did not care about democracy. They cared about order, efficiency, and profit. And in the late 1920s, they began to notice an agitating politician in Munich. A man with a small mustache and a hypnotic voice who spoke of restoring Germany's greatness, of breaking the chains of Versailles, and of conquering living space in the East. At first, the corporate aristocrats of IG Farben looked down on Adolf Hitler with contempt. They considered him a vulgar bohemian corporal. But Carl Duisberg and his successors were pragmatists. They listened to what Hitler promised: rearmament, self-sufficiency, the elimination of communist trade unions. Hitler needed synthetic rubber for his trucks because Germany had no tropical colonies. He needed synthetic gasoline for his tanks because Germany had no oil. And there was only one entity in the world capable of creating those miracles on an industrial scale: IG Farben. The chemistry and the Nazism were made for each other. Both believed in technical superiority. Both believed in reshaping the world through will and science, and both were completely lacking in human compassion. In 1932, 1 year before Hitler took power, a crucial meeting took place. The directors of IG Farben opened their checkbooks and financed the Nazi Party's electoral campaign with millions of marks. It was the best investment in their history. When Hitler became chancellor, IG Farben became the regime's company, and Bayer, as one of the founding pillars of the cartel, was ready for its darkest act. They had gone from heroin to mustard gas. Now they were preparing for something even worse: industrial slavery and mechanized genocide. The stage was set. The Auschwitz factory was about to be drawn on the blueprints. And Zyklon B, a simple blue pesticide, waited in the warehouses for its terrible destiny. Berlin, February 20th, 1933. The night is freezing cold, but inside the official residence of the President of the Reichstag, the atmosphere is electric. Hermann Göring has summoned the industrial elite of Germany. The richest men in the country, the owners of the smokestacks and the mines, step out of their dark limousines. Among them, walking with the confidence of men who know they own the future, are the directors of IG Farben, with the spirit of Carl Duisberg floating above them. Adolf Hitler enters the room. He does not shout. He does not gesticulate as he does in public squares. He speaks calmly to these men of business. He promises them order. He promises that the trade unions will be crushed. He promises that the German army will once again be the greatest in the world. But above all, he asks them for something: money, funds for the electoral campaign that will consolidate his absolute power. The directors of IG Farben do not hesitate. They are pragmatists. They know the war Hitler plans will require chemicals on a scale never before seen. That night, the chemical cartel signs a check for 400,000 imperial marks. It is the largest donation of the evening. It is the down payment on a partnership that will turn the laboratories of Bayer and its partners into the architects of an industrial nightmare. From that moment forward, the distinction between the Nazi state and IG Farben disappears. They become a single entity. The government provides the capital and the objectives. The company provides the science and the execution. Hitler knows that without the chemists of Leverkusen and Frankfurt, his tanks would stop for lack of fuel, and his soldiers would march barefoot for lack of rubber. E.G. Farben becomes the Ministry of Chemistry of the Third Reich. But while the engineers design processes to synthesize gasoline from coal in the pesticide departments, a horror of a different nature is taking shape. A horror not measured in octane, but in human lives per minute. Let us return for a moment to the Bayer laboratories of the 1920s. There, a team of scientists had perfected a product for public hygiene. Zyklon B consisted of small plaster pellets impregnated with hydrogen cyanide. It was used to disinfect barracks, ships, and trains. It was an extremely effective poison against lice, the carriers of typhus. By law, Zyklon B was required to contain a warning agent, a chemical irritant that gave off a sharp odor and made the eyes water. It was an essential safety measure. If a human being smelled it, they knew they had to run. It was the difference between a pesticide and a chemical weapon. However, in 1941, when the Nazi leadership decided that mass murder must be industrialized, the orders for Zyklon B arriving at Degesch, the subsidiary controlled by I.G. Farben, began to change. The SS made an unusual technical request. They asked that Zyklon B be manufactured without the warning agent. They wanted a gas that was odorless. They wanted the victims not to know they were dying until it was too late. The directors of I.G. Farben could have said no. They could have cited safety regulations or medical ethics, but they did not. On the contrary, they accelerated production. They understood perfectly well what use an odorless pesticide would serve in a concentration camp. The gas that had once saved lives by killing lice would now become the primary tool for the extermination of millions. Every can of Zyklon B that arrived at Auschwitz bore a profit stamp for I.G. Farben. Death had become a mass-market consumer product, with invoices, delivery schedules, and quality controls. The pharmacy of the devil had found its flagship product, murder by catalog. But the gas was only part of the business. I.G. Farben had a far more ambitious project. They wanted to build the largest chemical plant in the history of humanity, an industrial city that would be the pride of German technology. They called it the Buna plant, after their synthetic rubber. They were looking for a site with three characteristics: access to rail lines, an abundance of water, and an inexhaustible source of cheap labor. They found the perfect location in Upper Silesia, near a crossroads called Auschwitz. There, I.G. Farben did not merely collaborate with the Auschwitz concentration camp. They built their own camp. It was called Auschwitz III, or Monowitz. It was the first concentration camp in history, financed, constructed, and operated by a private company. A pharmaceutical and chemical corporation was now the owner of slaves. Imagine the scale of the construction: thousands of tons of steel, miles of piping, giant reactors rising like metal cathedrals, and beneath those structures, a mass of human beings reduced to spare parts. Prisoners arriving in cattle cars were subjected to immediate selection. Those deemed fit for work were not sent to the SS gas chambers, not yet. They were sent to the I.G. Farben factory. They were rented by the company from the Nazi state at a daily fee: 4 marks for a skilled worker, 3 marks for an unskilled laborer. For the management of Bayer and I.G. Farben, these men and women were calories being converted into work. The logic was brutally simple. A prisoner had to produce more value in labor than the cost of his food and lodging. And since the food was dirty water with potato peels and the lodging was rat-infested wooden barracks, the profit was immense. The life expectancy at Monowitz was even lower than at other camps. The construction work on the Buna plant was exhausting. Prisoners had to carry 110-pound cement sacks while running under the lashes of German foremen. If a man fell and could not get up, the foreman made a sign. The man was pulled aside and placed on the next truck to Auschwitz II, Birkenau, to be gassed with the Zyklon B produced by the very same company for which he had just been working. It was a perfect and terrifying human recycling machine. It is at this point that we enter the secret Bayer archives. We must stop here because they represent the pinnacle of scientific dehumanization. While the rubber factory grew, the pharmaceutical laboratories of Bayer in Leverkusen needed data. They wanted to test new vaccines against typhus, new anesthetics, and new chemical drugs. But the laws of science require testing on humans. This is where commercial letters become evidence of crimes against humanity. The directors of Bayer wrote to the Auschwitz commandant with the cold detachment of someone ordering office supplies. We need a batch of 150 healthy women to test a new preparation. When the camp responded with a price of 200 marks per woman, Bayer negotiated. That is too expensive. We offer 170 per head. That 30-mark difference is the measure of the corporate morality of the era. The deal was closed. The 150 women were delivered. Bayer's scientists injected them with experimental substances. They were not trying to cure them. They were trying to observe how long they took to die, or what devastating side effects the drugs produced on their organs. The final letter, written in Bayer's official typeface, read, "The experiments have been concluded. All subjects have died. We will be in contact regarding the next shipment. All have died." There was no expression of sorrow, no internal investigation, only a need for more material. But there was someone else at Auschwitz, working in close collaboration with Bayer's chemists, a man whose name has become synonymous with medical nightmare. Dr. Joseph Mengele was not a lone madman. He was a researcher seeking academic prestige in the New Germany, and a large portion of his funding and supplies came from IG-Farben. The company supplied him with experimental drugs to test on twins and children. Mengele, in return, sent human organs, blood samples, and detailed autopsy notes to the company's laboratories for analysis. There was a constant flow of human tissue traveling from the Auschwitz crematoria to the microscopes of Bayer's scientists. Science for a better life had become science for an efficient death. As the war moved toward its inevitable end, the Buna plant at Auschwitz never produced a single gram of synthetic rubber. Allied bombing and technical difficulties prevented it. But that did not mean IG-Farben lost money. The company charged for every phase of the process. They charged for the Zyklon B. They charged for the construction of the gas chambers. They charged for the gas. They charged for the crematoria. They charged for the ovens. They charged for the incinerators. They charged for the gas masks. 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 They charged for the gas masks construction. They charged for the Zyklon B gas sold to the SS for the gas chambers. They charged for the medical experiments. Auschwitz was, for Bayer and its partners, an immense billing operation based on extermination. The executives lived in a bubble of luxury. While just a few miles away their slaves were dying of starvation, they held gala dinners in the factory dining rooms, toasting with champagne to new technical advances. They were convinced they were the masters of the New World Order. They believed history was written by the victors, and they felt invincible. Even when the Red Army was just miles from the factory in January of 1945, the director's greatest concern was destroying the archives. Thousands of documents were burned. The records of the purchase of the 150 women, the gas supply contracts, the photographs of management inspections of the slave barracks. Everything had to disappear. But German bureaucracy was too efficient for its own good. Many copies of these letters were stored in other departments. Many lower-ranking workers could not burn everything. And when the Allied soldiers finally entered Leverkusen and Frankfurt, they discovered the paper trail of the pharmacy of the devil. The liberation of Auschwitz revealed to the world an IG-Farben factory surrounded by corpses. The American prosecutors, led by Telford Taylor, could not believe what they were seeing. They were not prosecuting crude military men. They were prosecuting the most educated and cultured men in Germany. Doctors of chemistry, financial experts, leaders of industry. In 1947, the IG-Farben trial began in Nuremberg. It was the sixth of the subsidiary trials. Prosecutor Taylor was blunt in his opening statement. These men are not simply war criminals in the traditional sense. They are the necessary facilitators of evil. Without IG-Farben, Hitler would not have had the gas for his chambers, nor the rubber for his tanks, nor the gasoline for his planes. They are the true architects of the Holocaust. The Bayer directors sat in the dock. They looked indignant. They argued they were merely businessmen following orders. They said they did not know what was happening in the gas chambers, despite the fact that they themselves sold the gas and operated the adjacent slave camp. It seemed the world was finally going to deliver justice. But international politics was about to intervene. The Cold War was beginning. The United States needed a strong, rebuilt Germany to counter the Soviet Union. And to rebuild Germany, they needed the chemists. They needed the executives. They needed IG-Farben. What happened after the trials is perhaps the greatest slap in the face to the victims in the entire arc of history. The verdict was shockingly lenient. Of the 24 defendants, 10 were acquitted entirely. The remaining 13 received ridiculous sentences of between 1 and 8 years in prison. And most insultingly, the time already spent in custody was subtracted from their sentences. The message was clear. Corporate crime, even when it involves genocide, carries a very low price tag if you are useful to the new masters of the world. Fritz Termeer, the executive who personally supervised the construction of the slave factory at Auschwitz-Monowitz and who had defended the use of prisoners by arguing they weren't accustomed to working anyway, was sentenced to only 7 years. He left prison in 1950 after serving less than 3 years for good behavior. The pharmacy of the devil had not only survived the trial, it had won. The road was clear for resurrection. 1951. IG Farben, the giant that Eisenhower had wanted to destroy, was formally divided, but it was not destroyed. It was simply separated back into its original components: Bayer, BASF, and Hoechst. It was as if the monster had divided itself into 3, each with the same genetic code, the same ambition, and the same leaders. Bayer was reborn officially as an independent company in Leverkusen, and here is where the story becomes truly unsettling. Anyone would think that after a scandal of such magnitude, the company would try to distance itself from its former Nazi leadership. They would seek new faces, fresh blood, a new ethic. But they did exactly the opposite. In a display of cynicism without precedent, the very same men who had just walked out of Allied prisons were invited to resume their old positions. Fritz Termeer, the man who had purchased women at Auschwitz, the convicted war criminal, did not hide in exile. In 1956, he was named chairman of the Bayer Supervisory Board. Yes, the man who supervised the industrial Holocaust was now the public face of the new democratic Bayer. He was not alone. The list of post-war Bayer directors reads like a census from the Nuremberg proceedings. Ulrich Haberland, another IG Farben veteran, was named Director General. Karl Winokur, another collaborator of the regime, took command of Hoechst. The pharmacy of the devil was not only still open, the same pharmacists were back behind the counter. Then began the greatest corporate image laundering operation in history. Bayer needed the world to forget the gas chambers and remember the aspirin. They invested astronomical sums in advertising. The slogan, "Science for a Better Life," was etched into the minds of consumers. The Bayer cross returned to shine in stadiums, in pharmacies across the globe, on billboards from New York to Tokyo. They recovered their international patents. They fought in the courts to once again own the aspirin trademark in every market. They presented themselves to the world as the symbol of the German economic miracle, a company of peaceful scientists dedicated to the progress and health of humanity. Leverkusen became a prosperous city once more, and the people who lived there, many of whom had worked in the factory during the war, kept silent. The past was buried under a mountain of German marks and promises of prosperity. But the DNA of a corporation cannot be changed with a marketing campaign. The culture of the company, that culture of profit at any cost, inherited from Karl Duisberg and the barons of IG Farben, remained intact in the corridors of Leverkusen. And in the 1960s, that lack of scruples would manifest itself again in a series of disasters that demonstrated the devil never left. He simply traded his SS uniform for a white lab coat and a salesman's smile. Although Bayer attempts to distance itself from other pharmaceutical disasters of the era, the mentality of the post-war German chemical industry remained the same. A key example is the thalidomide scandal, marketed in Germany as Contagan. Although the original manufacturer was Grunenthal, the network of patents, chemists, and marketing of the era was dominated by the Leverkusen school. Bayer, meanwhile, launched itself into the conquest of new markets in the Third World. In Latin America and Southeast Asia, the company found the perfect stage to expand without the troublesome regulations beginning to emerge in Europe and the United States. They began selling extremely toxic pesticides, many of them direct derivatives of wartime poison gas research. Brazilian and Colombian farmers were sold chemical substances that were lethal not only to insects, but to human beings. The same chemists who had calculated the toxicity of Zyklon B now calculated the potency of organophosphates. Thousands of rural workers fell ill, suffered birth defects, and died. Meanwhile, Bayer's sales representatives assured them, just as they had done with heroin in 1900, that their products were completely safe if used correctly. The company also began to diversify into the world of blood products and vaccines. And here, in the 1970s and 80s, one of its most modern and lethal crimes would take shape. A crime that would demonstrate that for the pharmacy of the devil, a human life still carried the same value it had in Auschwitz, the price of a quarterly profit. By the late 1960s, Bayer was once again one of the largest and most respected companies on the planet. Fritz Termeer died in 1967 as a distinguished citizen, showered with honors and wealth. At his funeral, he was remembered as a pioneer of industry and a visionary of chemistry. Not one word about the 150 women, not a single mention of the Monowitz slaves. The amnesia was total. Bayer had accomplished the impossible, separating its products from its history. Millions of people around the world took their medications every day without knowing that the foundations of that company were built upon a mass grave. The Bayer cross had become a symbol of hope, while the gas they manufactured remained the symbol of absolute horror. But history is not a straight line of progress. It is a circle that always returns to its starting point. The arrogance of the directors, the conviction that they were above the law and morality, would set the stage for the next great horror. Because in Bayer's laboratories, a new virus was about to collide with corporate greed. By the late 1970s, Bayer was no longer a company attempting to redeem itself. It was an undisputed world power. The Bayer Cross dominated the global health market. They had left behind the soot of coal factories to enter the era of biotechnology and precision medicine. Their laboratories were glass temples where solutions were designed for problems that had once been considered death sentences. One of those problems was hemophilia, a cruel genetic disease that prevents the blood from clotting. For a hemophiliac, a small knock on the knee can mean an unbearable internal hemorrhage. A simple cut can be fatal. For centuries, these patients lived in fear, cycling in and out of hospitals with an extremely short life expectancy. But then, Bayer's biological division, known in the United States as Cutter Biological, presented a miraculous medication. Factor VIII was a protein concentrate extracted from human plasma. For hemophiliacs, Factor VIII was freedom. They could inject themselves at home and live a normal life. The product was so valuable and so expensive to produce that in financial circles it was called liquid gold. The profits for Bayer were massive, but the production of this gold hid a dirty secret in its supply chain. To manufacture a single dose of Factor VIII, Bayer needed the plasma of thousands of donors. And, to maximize profits, the company did not always seek the healthiest donors. In a system that recalled the ethical failures of its founding years, the company obtained plasma from high-risk populations, prisoners in United States jails, drug addicts in inner-city neighborhoods, and people in third-world countries who sold their blood for a few dollars to afford food. The plasma of 10,000 different people was mixed in enormous tanks. It was biological Russian roulette. If a single donor among those 10,000 carried a viral disease, the entire batch was contaminated. Bayer knew this. Their scientists perfectly understood the risk of hepatitis and other viruses, but the business was too profitable to stop over statistical possibilities. And then, in the early 1980s, a new specter appeared on the horizon. The HIV virus, the cause of AIDS, was beginning to decimate populations. and no one knew exactly how it was transmitted until hemophiliacs began to die. By 1983, the evidence was undeniable. Bayer's Factor VIII was transmitting AIDS to its patients. The hemophiliac children who had been treated with the product so they could play and run like everyone else were testing positive for HIV. It was a tragedy of biblical proportions. The families who had trusted the Bayer cross to save their children now watched them wither away from a disease with no cure. Bayer and Cutter Biological faced a corporate dilemma. They could recall the product immediately, lose millions of dollars in inventory, and admit the error. Or they could try to salvage their investment. In 1984, Bayer developed a new technical process. They discovered that heating the Factor VIII concentrate eliminated the HIV virus, making the medication safe. It was a scientific victory. They immediately began selling the new heat-treated product in the United States and Western Europe. Patients in New York, London, and Berlin were safe. But here is where the pharmacy of the devil revealed its true face. The same one it had shown in the Heroin years and in the Auschwitz barracks. Bayer still had in its warehouses millions of dollars worth of old Factor VIII. Product they knew with total scientific certainty was contaminated with the AIDS virus. They had two options: destroy it and absorb the losses, or sell it in places where the laws were weaker and the people more desperate. They chose the second option. Internal company documents that would surface years later in journalistic investigations and mass lawsuits revealed a commercial strategy that can only be described as criminal. While Bayer sold the safe product in wealthy nations, it continued exporting the contaminated product to Hong Kong, Taiwan, Malaysia, Argentina, and Mexico. Imagine being a Bayer executive in 1985. In front of you is a report stating that the batch of Factor VIII, destined for Taiwan, has a high probability of containing HIV. You know there is a new, safe product available in the room next door, but you also know that if you ship the old product, the company's numbers at month's end will look much better. Bayer shipped the old product. It fought to prevent the health authorities of those countries from demanding the safe version. In Hong Kong and Taiwan, the company's representatives argued that the old product was equally safe and that the new one was too expensive. They actively deceived doctors and local health ministries. The result was a silent massacre. Thousands of hemophiliacs across Asia and Latin America were deliberately infected by the company. Many of them were children. In Taiwan, more than 100 hemophiliacs contracted AIDS directly from Bayer's medication. In Hong Kong, the figures were similar. When activists and families of victims began asking questions, Bayer's response was the same they had used at the Nuremberg trials: denial and obfuscation. They said the science at the time was unclear, despite the fact that their own internal documents said exactly the opposite. They said they had acted ethically, according to the standards of the era. The cruelty of this decision is difficult to process. This was not a technical error. It was an accounting decision. For Bayer, the life of a child in Malaysia or Argentina was worth less than the cost of discarding a batch of old medication. It was the spirit of IG Farben reincarnated in the age of globalization, the idea that certain populations are expendable if the corporate profit is high enough. In the late 1990s, the scandal finally exploded in the international press. Thanks to investigations by the New York Times and other outlets, Bayer faced an avalanche of lawsuits. But once again, the pharmacy of the devil demonstrated that it knows how to manage the system. Rather than go to trial and risk having its executives end up in prison or the full truth etched permanently into the public record, Bayer used its immense financial power to silence the problem. They paid hundreds of millions of dollars in out-of-court settlements to the victims and their families. But these settlements came with a catch. They included strict confidentiality clauses. The victims received money for their medical treatments, but in exchange, they were forbidden from speaking to the press or admitting that Bayer was guilty. The company purchased the silence of the dying. There was never a sincere public apology. Not one executive was prosecuted for murder or criminal negligence. For Bayer, the contaminated blood scandal was simply another cost of doing business, a negative figure on the balance sheet that would be compensated the following year with the sale of a new pesticide or a new cholesterol pill. This scandal proved that the denazification of the company had been superficial at best. The power structure, the primacy of dividends over ethics, and the vision of patients as mere risk-bearing consumers remained the core of the company. The pharmacy of the devil had proven that the only thing it had truly learned from Nuremberg was how to lawyer up faster. Consider the arithmetic of what happened. Bayer had knowingly shipped HIV-contaminated factor VIII to patients in Asia and Latin America after a safe alternative already existed in their own warehouses. They had made a deliberate financial calculation that the lives of children in Taiwan and Malaysia were an acceptable loss. In the language of a corporate memo, those children were what economists call an externality, a cost borne by parties outside the transaction, invisible in the profit and loss statement. The victims who signed the settlement agreements received checks that covered their mounting medical bills. In return, they surrendered their right to speak publicly, their right to stand before a judge and point at the company and name it as responsible. Bayer's lawyers had crafted the terms with surgical precision. The money flowed quietly. The silence was contractual, and the headlines faded before the full scope of the disaster could imprint itself on the public memory. It is worth pausing to understand what that silence represented. These were parents who had watched their sons, boys who had been given this medication so they could go to school, play sports, live something resembling an ordinary childhood, deteriorate and die from a disease that was then a death sentence. And the legal mechanism designed to compensate them had been restructured by the company's attorneys to simultaneously gag them. Justice was sold back to the victims in exchange for their voices. The New York Times investigation of 1996, which first brought the contaminated blood scandal to widespread American attention, described internal Bayer documents in which company officials explicitly discussed the risks of continuing to sell the old, unheated product in Asian markets while switching to the safe product domestically. The documents showed that the decision was commercial, not scientific. The science was settled. The HIV contamination was known. The choice to keep shipping the lethal product was made by human beings sitting in offices in Pennsylvania and Leverkusen, calculating margins. Carl Duisberg would have recognized the logic immediately. In his day, the calculus was applied to soldiers in the trenches of the Western Front and to prisoners in the barracks of Monowitz. In the 1980s, the same formula was applied to hemophiliac children in Kuala Lumpur and Buenos Aires. The inputs had changed. The algorithm had not. Bayer eventually paid out roughly $600 million in total settlements related to the contaminated factor VIII scandal. That figure, enormous as it sounds, was absorbed by a corporation with annual revenues counted in the tens of billions. It was, in the cold language of corporate finance, manageable. No Bayer executive served a day in prison. No criminal charges were brought. The company was not dismantled, not investigated by a prosecutor with the authority of Telford Taylor, not placed before a tribunal in a city where the rubble of a destroyed civilization still lay in the streets as testimony to what unchecked corporate power could produce when it married ideology. The world had decided, as it had decided in 1951, that it needed Bayer too much to hold it accountable in any meaningful way. The pharmaceutical giant was too deeply woven into the fabric of global health. It's aspirin, it's antibiotics, it's cancer drugs, it's agricultural chemicals. The dependency was structural. You could not extract Bayer from modern civilization without tearing something vital in the process. And so the company continued. It adapted, it survived, it grew. There is a term in biology for organisms that have adapted over millions of years to resist every environmental threat thrown at them. Every ice age, every mass extinction, every predator. They are called living fossils. Bayer, in the world of corporate entities, has become something like a living fossil of a different kind. It has survived the collapse of the German Empire, the hyperinflation of the Weimar Republic, the Allied firebombing, the Nuremberg trials, the Cold War restructuring, the contaminated blood lawsuits, and every regulatory challenge mounted against it in every jurisdiction across the globe. Each time the environment turned hostile, it evolved just enough to endure, and then resumed its fundamental behavior at the first opportunity. The men and women who work at Bayer today are overwhelmingly ordinary people. Scientists who genuinely want to cure disease. Engineers who find meaning in building something useful. Sales representatives who believe in the products they carry in their briefcases. The institution, however, is something older and harder than any of them. It is a structure of incentives and relationships and accumulated capital that predates every current employee by more than a century and a half. The institution has its own memory, its own reflexes, its own immune system. And when that immune system is threatened, it responds the way it has always responded, with litigation, with lobbying, with strategic silence, and with the patient confidence that the world will eventually decide it needs Bayer more than it needs justice. That confidence, as the history of the company demonstrates, has never once been misplaced. Which brings us to the final chapter. Because Bayer, entering the 21st century, was not content to merely maintain its position in pharmaceuticals, it was not satisfied with continuing to dominate the market for aspirin and chemotherapy drugs and pesticide spray. Its leadership had identified a new frontier, a domain so fundamental to human existence that controlling it would make every previous Bayer business look small by comparison. They wanted to own what people eat. They wanted to be inside the food chain itself, not as a supplier of chemicals that protect crops, but as the owner of the seeds from which those crops grew. They wanted a monopoly that began before the farmer ever touched the soil and followed the food from the field to the factory to the store shelf and into the human body. To achieve that ambition, they needed to make the most controversial acquisition in corporate history. As the company entered the new millennium, Bayer was preparing for its next great transformation. They had consolidated themselves in pharmaceuticals, but they wanted to dominate something more fundamental than medicine. They wanted to dominate food. They wanted to control what the world eats, from the seed before it touches the soil to the plate on the dinner table. If you can control what people eat, if you can be the owner of the seed before it touches the earth, you hold a kind of power that no 20th century dictator ever dreamed of. Bayer was already a giant in the pesticide sector, but it wanted total monopoly. In 2016, it initiated the most ambitious and risky operation in its history. It set its sights on an American company whose reputation was perhaps the only one in the world capable of competing in darkness with IG Farben's Nazi past. It set its sights on Monsanto. Monsanto was not just any company. They were the creators of PCBs, polychlorinated biphenyls, toxic chemical substances that contaminated rivers across the world for decades, leaching into fish and groundwater and human tissue across every continent. They were the creators of Agent Orange, the chemical defoliant that devastated the jungles of Vietnam and left a legacy of birth defects and cancer in thousands of American soldiers and Vietnamese civilians alike. They were the owners of genetically modified seeds and the best-selling herbicide on the planet, Roundup, based on a molecule called glyphosate, a product so ubiquitous that it had been detected in the urine of people who had never set foot on a farm. When Bayer announced it would buy Monsanto for $63 billion, financial analysts called it a strategic consolidation, a smart vertical integration of a chemical giant with an agricultural powerhouse. But environmental advocates and historians called it the marriage from hell. The inventors of Zyklon B gas were joining forces with the inventors of Agent Orange. It was the ultimate fusion of European poison with American poison. Two corporations, each the product of a different century of industrial recklessness, combining into a single entity that would control an extraordinary percentage of the world's food supply. The corporate logic was impeccable. The human logic was terrifying. Together, Bayer and Monsanto would own patents on seeds, on the chemicals that killed competing plants around those seeds, on the chemicals that killed insects threatening those plants, and on the pharmaceuticals treating the diseases those chemicals caused in the people who ate those plants. It was a closed loop of dependency, and Bayer intended to own every link in the chain. Despite global protests, from environmental groups, from farmers' organizations, from public health researchers, from the governments of several European nations, the deal closed in June of 2018. Bayer, in a desperate attempt to clean up the image of its new acquisition, did something unprecedented. It eliminated the Monsanto name entirely. The brand disappeared from the face of the earth. No more Monsanto signage on the factories. No more Monsanto letterhead. The company that had spent decades as one of the most universally despised corporate names on the planet simply ceased to exist, at least nominally, but its products remained. Its employees remained, its science remained, and most importantly, its legal debts remained. They passed into the Bayer family with the quiet finality of an inheritance no one wanted. The pharmacy's cross now sheltered the king of herbicides. The blue and green logo of the world's most trusted pharmaceutical brand was now the public face of the people who made the chemical that American veterans blamed for their cancers and the Vietnamese blamed for their children's deformities. Bayer's communications team described the name Erasure as a branding decision, a fresh start. But karma, as Bayer knew well from its long history, always comes back to collect its debts. And Monsanto's debts were far larger than the accountants in Leverkusen had anticipated. The legal exposure was not theoretical. The lawsuits were already filed and moving through the American court system before the ink on the merger was dry. Just months after the purchase, the sky collapsed on Bayer. A California school groundskeeper named Dwayne Johnson, a 46-year-old man who had spent years spraying Roundup on school grounds and was now dying of terminal non-Hodgkin lymphoma, took the company to trial. Johnson had used Roundup extensively in his work and alleged that the glyphosate had caused his cancer. He had tried to reach Monsanto directly years earlier when his diagnosis came in, seeking information about whether the chemical might be responsible. Monsanto had not responded. Bayer, using the same strategy of denial it had deployed with heroin in 1910 and with the contaminated blood in the 1990s, mobilized its army of lawyers and salaried scientists. They presented studies financed by themselves, claiming the product was as safe as water. They attacked the credibility of independent researchers. They pointed to the Environmental Protection Agency's classification of glyphosate as not likely to be carcinogenic to humans. The defense seemed solid. But this time, the jury had access to something Bayer could not hide, could not buy into silence with settlement checks, could not erase with a rebranding exercise. The Monsanto papers were internal emails, hundreds of them, proving that the company had known for decades there were serious doubts about the safety of glyphosate. The documents revealed how the company had ghost-written scientific articles for hire and then paid outside scientists to sign them as if they were independent, peer-reviewed research. They revealed how company representatives had embedded themselves within the regulatory review process, working to shape the conclusions of agencies that were supposed to be evaluating the science without commercial interference. They revealed how Monsanto had maintained a list of scientists considered friendly to the company and a separate list of those to be neutralized. Their credibility attacked, their funding undermined. It was the same playbook Bayer had used to suppress the evidence of heroin addiction in 1908. The same playbook I.G. Farben had used to deny culpability at Nuremberg in 1947. The same playbook Cutter Biological had used to deny the HIV contamination in the 1990s. The script had not changed in over a century. Only the molecule at the center of the scandal had changed. Dwayne Johnson won. The jury not only awarded him $80 million in compensatory damages, but imposed $250 million in punitive damages against Bayer, declaring that the company had acted with malice and oppression. It was the first crack in the glass wall. The judge later reduced the punitive award, but the verdict stood. A dying school groundskeeper, a man with no legal training, no powerful backers, and nothing left to lose, had walked into an American courtroom and forced the world's most powerful pharmaceutical corporation to answer for what it knew and when it knew it. Behind Johnson came thousands of plaintiffs, then tens of thousands. Farmers who had spent decades spraying Roundup and developed lymphoma, gardeners, landscapers, parents whose children had played on lawns treated with the herbicide. By the year 2020, Bayer faced more than 125,000 lawsuits in the United States alone. Each one was a human being holding a diagnosis and a bottle of weed killer, standing in front of the same blue and green cross their parents had trusted for aspirin. The company that had survived the Nuremberg trials, the company that had put its own war criminal in the chairman's seat and resumed business as usual while the graves at Auschwitz were still fresh, was now being bled financially by ordinary Americans in civil courts. Bayer had to set aside $16 billion in reserves just to attempt to close these cases. Its market capitalization fell by more than $40 billion from the peak of its post-merger value. Shareholders who had cheered the Monsanto acquisition as a masterstroke of corporate strategy were now calling for the resignations of the executives who had championed it. Werner Baumann, Bayer's chief executive, who had orchestrated the merger against the advice of his own board and a majority of his shareholders, refused to step down. He argued that the legal liabilities were manageable, that the science on glyphosate remained contested, that the company's diversified portfolio would absorb the losses. He deployed the language of quarterly earnings calls in the face of what the plaintiffs' attorneys were calling the largest public health cover-up in agricultural history. But once again, the pharmacy of the devil demonstrated its capacity for mutation. They did not immediately pull glyphosate from the market. They announced an agreement to reformulate Roundup for consumer use in the American residential market, removing the active ingredient from products sold in hardware stores and garden centers while continuing to sell it commercially to agricultural customers. They changed the labels, they restructured the liability, they shifted assets into newly created subsidiary structures, and they continued selling glyphosate in the rest of the world, especially in developing countries where the laws are a distant echo of justice, where the regulatory agencies lack resources, where the farmers who depend on the chemical have no realistic access to American-style class action litigation. The pattern was the same one that had defined the company since 1898. When the wealthy world closes a door, find a window somewhere else. When the North American market demands the safe version of Factor VIII, ship the contaminated version to Asia. When American courts rule against glyphosate, keep selling it in Brazil and Argentina and India. The geography of corporate impunity has always mapped precisely onto the geography of poverty and weak governance. If we look at the complete history of Bayer, from that small dye workshop in 1863 to the biotechnology empire of today, a terrifyingly consistent pattern emerges. This is not a series of accidents. It is not a succession of isolated bad actors who happen to work at the same company across different eras. It is a methodology of existence, a corporate instinct as deeply embedded as the chemistry in its laboratories. Bayer is a company that has perfected the art of externalizing pain. They make money selling the cure, but they often make far more money by first creating the need or by ignoring the damage they cause. They sold heroin to cure coughs, and when the world became addicted, they sold other drugs to treat the addiction. They sold gas to kill lice. And when the regime asked them for gas to kill people, they simply removed the smell and sent the invoice. They sold contaminated blood because it was cheaper than throwing it away. And they bought Monsanto because they wanted to control life itself, knowing full well they were buying a legacy of poison. This is an entity that operates under a purely chemical logic. Morality is a contaminant that reduces the efficiency of the economic reaction. The men who run Bayer today are neither Nazis nor the drug dealers of the late 19th century. They are elite professionals with advanced degrees from excellent universities. They sit on the boards of charitable foundations. They give speeches at Davos about sustainability and corporate responsibility, but they serve the same structure of power that Carl Duisberg built in 1925. They serve a cross that has become a sword that cuts in both directions, healing and harming in the same motion, with perfect corporate indifference to which end does which. Today, Bayer leads the race in genetic editing. They are redesigning the DNA of plants. They are working on gene therapies that could eliminate hereditary diseases. They are developing drugs that may extend human lifespans in ways that were science fiction a generation ago. The scale of their scientific ambition is genuinely extraordinary. And that is the most disturbing thing of all. The world needs Bayer. We need their medicines. We need their vaccines. We need their capacity for innovation. The pharmacy of the devil has made itself indispensable. They have made us dependent on them, just as the patients of 1900 were dependent on their heroin syrup, just as the hemophiliac children of 1985 were dependent on their factor VIII. The dependency is the product. It was always the product. From the first bottle of Bayer heroin mailed to an American household without a prescription, to the genetically modified seed that cannot be replanted without licensing, the fundamental business model has remained constant. Create the need, own the solution, and make the customer unable to live without you. We have traveled 160 years of shadows. We have seen the children of 1890 taking their heroin syrup before bed, their mothers reading the Bayer advertisement while tucking them in. We have heard the sound of boots on the factory floor at Auschwitz, the sound of a corporate timesheet being checked against a prisoner's daily output. We have seen the faces of hemophiliac patients deliberately infected with the AIDS virus because the quarterly numbers needed to hold. And we have seen the farmland sprayed with substances that poison the soil and the body, while the company's scientists assure the world the product is as safe as water. Can we forgive Bayer? The company's defenders will say they have saved billions of lives with aspirin. They will point to the cancer drugs that have given patients years they otherwise would not have had. They will say, we cannot judge a 21st century company for what IG Farben did in the 1940s, cannot hold modern employees accountable for decisions made by men who are long dead. They will say that the contaminated blood scandal was an industry-wide failure, that the glyphosate science remains genuinely contested, that the company has paid its legal penalties and reformed its practices. They will say all of that, and some of it will even be partially true. But history is not a book that can be closed and thrown away. History lives in the archives, in the letters written on Bayer letterhead offering 170 marks per woman. History lives in the scars of the survivors, in the families of hemophiliac children who died in Taiwan and Malaysia in the late 1980s. History lives in the behavior of corporations, not in what they say at press conferences, but in what they do when the regulatory agency is underfunded, when the plaintiff is in a developing country, when the jury is not watching, when the science is just slightly ambiguous enough to create the cover they need. A company that places profit above human life, again and again, across 3 different centuries, on 4 different continents, involving 4 different products, is not making mistakes. It is following its nature. It is expressing, with remarkable consistency, the values that were hardwired into its institutional DNA by Friedrich Bayer and Friedrich Westcott in 1863 and Carl Duisberg in 1925. The next time you walk into a pharmacy and see that white box with the blue cross, stop for a moment. Pick it up. Hold it in your hand. It is probably aspirin. It is probably exactly what it says it is. A safe, effective painkiller that has relieved the suffering of countless millions of people and prevented heart attacks and strokes and deaths too numerous to count. Felix Hoffmann's great gift to humanity, the product of his love for his arthritic father, the molecule that should have been his entire legacy. But remember that the relief you are seeking has been bankrolled by a century and a half of tragedies. Remember that the building where that aspirin was manufactured was built on the same corporate foundations as the factory at Auschwitz. Remember that the company whose name is printed on that box has, at multiple points in its history, looked at human suffering as a line item in a spreadsheet and found it acceptable. Remember that science is a tool of extraordinary power, a tool that can give a paralyzed man his mobility back, that can cure a child's infection, that can feed a hungry world, but that in the hands of unchecked institutional greed, it becomes something else entirely, something that the fields of Ypres and the chambers of Birkenau and the wards of hospitals in Manila and Sao Paulo know very well. The pharmacy of the devil is still open. Its lights are bright. Its floors are clean. Its annual report features photographs of smiling children and fields of golden wheat and medical professionals in gleaming white coats. Its employees are polite. Its advertising is tasteful and precisely calibrated to generate trust. But in the basements of memory, the gas is still flowing. The heroin is still bottled. The contaminated blood is still packaged, and the price of a human life remains for the institution, not for its employees, not for its scientists, but for the structure itself. A simple negotiable figure in a quarterly earnings report, a variable to be optimized, an externality to be managed. This is the true history of Bayer. Science for a better life, they say. But after everything we have seen, after the heroin syrup and the mustard gas and the slave labor and the Nuremberg acquittals and the contaminated Factor 8 and the Monsanto papers, after all of it, the question remains hanging in the air, unresolved, unanswered, patient as poison. Whose life? Monsanto was not just any company. They were the creators of PCBs, toxic chemical substances that contaminated rivers across the world for decades. They were the creators of Agent Orange, the chemical defoliant that devastated the jungles of Vietnam and left a legacy of birth defects and cancer in thousands of soldiers and civilians. They were the owners of genetically modified seeds and the best-selling herbicide on the planet, Roundup, based on a molecule called glyphosate. When Bayer announced it would buy Monsanto for $63 billion, financial analysts called it a strategic consolidation. But environmental advocates and historians called it the marriage from hell. The inventors of Zyklon B gas were joining forces with the inventors of Agent Orange. It was the ultimate fusion of European poison with American poison. Despite global protests, the deal closed in June of 2018. Bayer, in a desperate attempt to clean up the image of its new acquisition, did something unprecedented. It eliminated the Monsanto name. The brand disappeared from the face of the earth, but its products, its employees, and, most importantly, its legal debts passed into the Bayer family. The pharmacy's cross now sheltered the king of herbicides. But karma, as Bayer knew well from its long history, always comes back to collect its debts. And Monsanto's debts were far larger than the accountants in Leverkusen had anticipated. Just months after the purchase, the sky collapsed on Bayer. A California school groundskeeper named Dwayne Johnson, who was dying of terminal non-Hodgkin lymphoma, took the company to trial. Johnson had used Roundup for years in his work and alleged that the glyphosate had caused his cancer. Bayer, using the same strategy of denial it had used with heroin and the contaminated blood, mobilized its army of lawyers and salaried scientists. They presented studies financed by themselves, claiming the product was as safe as water. They attacked the credibility of independent researchers, but this time, the jury had access to something Bayer could not hide. The Monsanto papers were internal emails proving that the company had known for decades there were serious doubts about the safety of glyphosate. The documents revealed how the company had ghostwritten scientific articles for hire and then paid outside scientists to sign them as if they were independent. They revealed how the company pressured regulatory agencies to ignore negative data. Dwayne Johnson won. The jury not only awarded him compensation, but imposed a massive punitive fine against Bayer, declaring that the company had acted with malice and oppression. It was the first crack in the glass wall. Behind Johnson came thousands more plaintiffs, farmers, gardeners, parents whose children had played on lawns sprayed with the chemical. By the year 2020, Bayer faced more than 125,000 lawsuits in the United States alone. The company that had survived the Nuremberg trials was now being bled financially by ordinary citizens in civil courts. Bayer had to set aside $16 billion to attempt to close these cases. Its shares plummeted. Shareholders who had once toasted the Monsanto purchase were now demanding the heads of executives. But once again, the pharmacy of the devil demonstrated its capacity for mutation. They did not immediately pull the product. They simply changed the labels, shifted their assets, and continued selling glyphosate in the rest of the world, especially in developing countries where the laws are a distant echo of justice. If we look at the complete history of Bayer, from that small dye workshop in 1863 to the biotechnology empire of today, a terrifyingly consistent pattern emerges. This is not a series of accidents. It is a methodology of existence. Bayer is a company that has perfected the art of externalizing pain. They make money selling the cure, but they often make far more money by first creating the need or by ignoring the damage they cause. They sold heroin to cure coughs, and when the world became addicted, they sold other drugs to treat the addiction. They sold gas to kill lice. And when the regime asked them for gas to kill people, they simply removed the smell and sent the invoice. They sold contaminated blood because it was cheaper than throwing it away. And they bought Monsanto because they wanted to control life itself, knowing full well they were buying a legacy of poison. This is an entity that operates under a purely chemical logic. Morality is a contaminant that reduces the efficiency of the economic reaction. The men who run Bayer today are neither Nazis nor the drug dealers of the late 19th century. They are elite professionals, but they serve the same structure of power. They serve a cross that has become a sword that cuts in both directions. Today, Bayer leads the race in genetic editing. They are redesigning the DNA of plants and searching for cures for diseases that today seem impossible to treat. And that is the most disturbing thing of all. The world needs Bayer. We need their medicines, their vaccines, their capacity for innovation. The pharmacy of the devil has made itself indispensable. They have made us dependent on them, just as the patients of 1900 were dependent on their heroin. We have traveled 160 years of shadows. We have seen the children of 1890 taking their heroin syrup before bed. We have heard the sound of boots on the factory floor at Auschwitz. We have seen the faces of hemophiliac patients deliberately infected with the AIDS virus, and we have seen the farmland sprayed with substances that poison the soil and the body. Can we forgive Bayer? The company's defenders will say they have saved billions of lives with aspirin and their modern antibiotics. They will say, we cannot judge a 21st century company for what IG Farben did in the 1940s. But history is not a book that can be closed and thrown away. History lives in the archives, in the scars of the survivors, and in the present behavior of corporations. A company that places profit above human life again and again across 3 different centuries is not making mistakes. It is following its nature. The next time you walk into a pharmacy and see that white box with the blue cross, stop for a moment. Remember that the relief you are seeking has been bankrolled by a century of tragedies. Remember that science is a powerful tool, but in the hands of blind greed, it becomes a weapon of mass destruction. The pharmacy of the devil is still open. Its lights are bright. Its floors are clean. Its employees are friendly. But in the basements of memory, the gas is still flowing. The heroin is still bottled. And the price of a human life remains, for them, a simple negotiable figure in a quarterly earnings report. This is the true history of Bayer. Science for a better life, they say. But after everything we have seen, the question remains hanging in the air. Whose life?